So the alternative food movement is 50 years old now, and it's still trying to gain traction. I know a little bit about the alternative food movement because when I was 8 years old, my parents went back to the land and they turned our 20-acre suburban plot into a working farm. So I grew up raising my own vegetables, meat, eggs. We harvested wood from the forest to heat our house, to heat our water, to cook our food. We were crazy about sustainability in the 1970s. But I'll be honest, I thought my parents were nuts. I thought they were crazy. So these photos here is not actually the farm I grew up on. I asked my mom if we had photos from those days, and she said, honey, we were working too hard to take pictures of ourselves. But this is because I put a search into Google for Back to the Land 1970, after which came up hundreds of photographs, right? My parents weren't actually nuts. My parents were part of a social movement that was emerging in the 1970s. This was when young people, just like all of you, decided to go back to the land. They were working from the environmental critique, which had started a few years earlier, but they were focused on food. And they literally went back to the land. They became farmers, right? People who had never farmed before stepped into it. And this wasn't just an idealistic pursuit, right? First of all, they put their bodies into it. But second, this wasn't an abstraction for them, because when they looked out at the food system, looked out at the farms in the 1970s, what they saw was an ecological disaster, right? Rachel Carson had warned us in the 1960s that herbicides, pesticides, these toxins were horrible for the environment. Turns out agriculture was the biggest culprit. They were saturating farm fields with pesticides and herbicides, and all of that was bioaccumulating up into ecosystems. And the farms themselves, they were enormous at this point. They're being run with these huge technological devices which are pounding the soils. It's all the same crop for acre after acre. It's not good for the landscape. So these young people were looking around in the 1970s and saying, you know, our food system's broken. And if the farmscape wasn't enough to convince them, walk into a supermarket in the 1970s. The ugly colors weren't enough. All you've got there is non-food. There's no food in sight. What do I mean by food? Real food? I mean plants and animals that we eat, or some derivative of them that you can recognize. None of it in sight, right? These are boxes of preservatives and coloring and sugars and salts and fats, and everything's packaged for convenience. So both the retail side of things and the farmscape side of things scared the bejesus out of my parents and their generation. And they went back to the land, but they also launched the alternative food movement, which has been underway for 50 years. You're probably familiar with some components of it. If it weren't for farmers like my parents, there's no organic farming. They invented that in opposition to all of the herbicides and pesticides being poured on the fields. They got together and they created these cooperatives, so they were kind of hippie lefties. They wanted to drop out of the market, so they'd build these food cooperatives where they could aggregate their food and share it with neighbors and maybe sell a little bit of it. Most of them weren't market oriented. A few of them were, and the few that were, well, they're the people who invented or who created and started Whole Foods. Whole Foods is a direct descendant of these 1970s hippies and their cooperative ideas about food. By the 1980s, communities were realizing there was a demand for fresh food in their neighborhoods, and they started creating farmers markets, inviting farmers into populated places with their produce to sell them, right? We get into the 21st century, some of you are probably familiar with urban agriculture, this idea that we've got these wasted open spaces in urban places where food insecurity exists. Let's put food in there to feed people and perhaps even to create jobs around that. And since about 2000, 2001, extension agents in the land grants around the United States have been training beginning farmers, young farmers. There's a big demand by young people, retired people, and people looking to change their careers to become farmers. 50 years of this, right? I'm so proud of my parents. We've done all this work to create an alternative food system. But you all know You walk into a supermarket today, and it's probably worse than that 1970 supermarket. Aisle after aisle, shelf after shelf of these quasi-food items. This is ultra-processed grains. The grains are no good for you anymore. Mixed with salts and sugars and chemicals and colorings. It's barely food. And almost the entire supermarket is filled with this stuff in these bright new colors that attract the eye. Corn syrup in carbonated water. It's the only thing you can get over in the cafeteria over there, by the way. This is a suburban supermarket. When you get into low-income neighborhoods, all you have are convenience store. So you might think about this space as kind of like a diabetes cave. There's not a single item in that convenience store that has any nutritional value for human health. These are products that are put out there not to satisfy and nourish people. They're put out there to move the product. So they're addictive, you want more of them, they're cheap enough so you can buy them, and they're literally killing us. So 50 years later, we haven't solved the retail problem. And the truth is, when we look out at the fields, we're not doing so much better out there either. Now, we've lowered the amount of pesticides that we pour out on our agriculture, but we've tripled or quadrupled the herbicides that we're pouring out there, right? Because we've got these random wild weeds that are growing up in response to all the herbicides that we have used. And we have to make new herbicides and pour more of them to make our agriculture effective. And our machines are larger, our farms are larger. If you look out in the Scioto or the Olentangy River, almost any time during the year, you see that brown color. That's our agricultural fields washing away out to the ocean. We're still damaging the ecosystem, and we can't get our retail right. I've been in this for 50 years. I've been in this movement for 50 years, and about 15 years ago I started asking myself, why can't we fix our food system? What are we getting wrong? What's not working here, right? And I think the key missing, I feel like I'm missing a slide here. I am missing a slide here. So we've got all of these options. Let's just think about the landscape today. We've got gardens everywhere. We've got people growing food in their yards saying, this is going to be enough food for my household. I can feed the community this way. I love gardens. I love gardens. There's no farmer there and there's no food being produced. Those are wonderful displays of what food production can be like, but they're not producing food. We've got these training programs, the ones I told you about. They last a week, maybe, a week to teach someone who's never farmed before how to become a farmer. And then they send them out and say, good luck, call us if you have any problems. And that's it. Most of those farmers last 2 years. Some of them get to 5 years. But we're producing these failing farmers as well. And then we have the farmers market. So who's been to a farmers market? Look at that. It is the most popular component of the alternative farm movement. And it's a wonderful experience, right? You get to meet the farmer. You get to buy this fresh produce. Maybe you're spending a little more than you would at Kroger, but man, it's worth it. It feels good. You're helping the farmer. Let me tell you the dirty secret about farmers market. They are an economic losing proposition for the farmers who participate in them. They're not going to tell you that, because the PR of being out there is worth it. And some of them edge through with these things. But let's just think about what it means for that farmer to be there at that farmer's market. It means they got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they packaged all of these vegetables, all of the supplies that they need for the market, they loaded it into a van, they drove 20, maybe 30, maybe an hour to get to the site, they set it all up, and then they sat there for 6 or 7 hours, during which they sell about a quarter of their produce. 6 or 7 hours later, the 3/4 that's remaining is no longer marketable. It's been sitting in the sun all day. And, well, you know, farms need to be tended every day. They've just spent a whole day away from their farm, right? Every farmer, if they're being honest with you, say, I like the interaction. I'm not making any money on this. And so we think about all of these failures. I've been sort of thinking about them, and notice that there's a really central missing piece in the heart of this. And that is that we've built a consumer movement about food that has neglected the farmer. We imagine the farmer would love to volunteer their time. I think sometimes we feel like we're doing them a favor by buying their food at the farmer's market, right? We've completely reoriented this towards our needs, and we've forgotten about the farmer. Well, let me tell you something. You can't have an alternative food movement if you do not have successful alternative farmers. And that's the piece that we're missing. Newsflash, farming is the hardest business that there is, right? So when we imagine that farmer living off of volunteers or wanting to do the service for the community to deliver the food, we forget that they live in the United States in a market economy. They have to make their business survive. They're a business. And it sounds simple on paper. All they got to do is grow the crops and sell the crops. And I won't get into the details of this, but let me tell you, every step along the way is filled with complexity and contingencies, and things can go wrong. And it's a business with very little margin. And so the farmer has to successfully get enough crops to harvest and find people to buy them at a high enough price so that they pay for their entire operation, they pay for all of their materials, and they cover their labor time. This is not a free proposition. It costs money. They need to do it. And it's insanely complicated. And so one of the things I concluded about 5 years ago was that we're doing it wrong. We're putting these individual farms, these small farms out there, these ambitious young people like my parents were, to somehow advance this movement without thinking about how they survive themselves. And so I started to focus on the farmer themselves. How do we make successful farmers? And I started working in 2016, 2017 with a group of students. Our question was, what's the right size? We're thinking about urban. So the question was, what's the right size urban farm? How can we direct urban farmers towards a scale that's going to be effective? And the question was, can we get something that's big enough to bring $35,000 or more a year net income, but small enough to be worked by an individual or an individual farm family? And the answer is the microfarm. Specs are up there. I'll be happy to answer more questions about that later. But we finished this and we realized, right, we've got this design now that can actually produce a nice supplemental income so long as that farmer is growing 12 months out of the year and they're using every square foot in every minute that they can use it, right? Which means they need to be intensively farming. They're going to run into the same problem that every small farmer runs into. I can't possibly market all of my food and survive. So we stepped back conceptually and said, yeah, let's not think about this as a single farmer. This is a map of the food deserts in Mansfield, Ohio. Let's think about it as 6, 7, 8, 10 microfarms. What happens if we put those together? Do we get enough aggregate crops out of all of those so that those farmers could take some of their surplus, create a cooperative organization, and hire someone to do all the marketing for them? So that marketer sitting up there in the aggregation cooperative, building the relationships, taking the orders, and then turning around and saying to the farmers, here's what you need to grow in what volume, at what time. They give them a crop plan. So we've simplified, mitigated a lot of the problems in farming itself. So this was the concept, this is the design that I used to build partnerships in Mansfield, build partnerships in the College of Ag. I'm in the College of Arts and Sciences, so I had to make that bridge and go after a grant from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research to see if we could build a pilot, and we did. So between 2019 and 2021, we built what we call the Microfarm Project. We trained a dozen beginning farmers on commercial horticulture. So we taught them about 60 different crops and how to grow them to get the best yield and the most marketable crops. We spent a year and a half in the field with these beginning farmers. And even after a year and a half, they were still struggling to deal with the things about farming. So a week-long workshop, not quite enough for that. We help them form their own farm businesses and their own cooperative businesses, the Richland Grow Op. And then we help them in the second year and a half of this grant codify their businesses, get their business plans together, and get their marketing arrangement together as well for the Richland Grow Up. So our grant money ended in 2021. We are going into 2025 and the Richland Grow Up is going strong. They did about $350,000 in produce sales last year. They added 8 new farms to the cooperative at the end of the year. These are small farms in Richland County struggling to get along who can now access the market that the Richland Grow Up represents. And they're looking at about $500,000 in produce next year, and they're aiming for $1 million within the next 2 to 5 years. We focused on farmers. We focused on farmers and we got nothing but growth, right? This is a growing social enterprise. This was what the grant wanted us to do. This is what we did, but when we finished, we looked around Mansfield and we realized, oh my God, we built a food system. We got a 12-acre urban farm that we built on top of a brownfield site that is a commercial production site. Our nonprofit partner produces, they're the largest producer for the cooperative. 2 other producing farmers lease land there, and then we use a tunnel to train other farmers in the community. We're bringing people from the community into the business. We have a farmers market there every Thursday through the entire season. We host work release men from the local prison. We have a farm to school program. This has become this community gem that's all about food. We also host events out there. Because of the work release program, we developed a relationship with the Richland County Correctional Institute, and in a partnership, we built a 4-acre garden on the prison itself that for the men who can't come out to the work release yet to get that opportunity to have experience with agriculture. We get about a dozen men a year out there. They grow the crops and sell them to support their own program. So they're inside of a circular economy. These guys report absolute transformation of their selves through the experience of farming. Something sort of mystical happens to them. We've right now got 4 homestead commercial urban farms right in the city center. These are microfarms built on land bank properties right next to houses. So you've got agriculture in the neighborhood, right? You've got this now visual marker about its presence, and it's an attractor. People from the neighborhood, kids from the neighborhood, people want to know what's going on. They become curious. It becomes a center in that community. Interestingly, our in the neighborhood farms also get visited by tons of deer, more deer than come to our 12-acre urban farm for some reason. And then we've partnered with the schools. We put microfarms in the intermediate, middle, and high school, and there are agricultural pathways for kids to go through the Mansfield Public Schools and come out farmers. So we built the social enterprise in order to focus on farmers. And then we got all of the local food system goods that those of us that work in this space are already striving for. But we've done something different here. We don't have to go chasing after charitable dollars to keep all of this afloat because it's built atop a social enterprise that is economically sustainable, that is making its way in the world by earning money by selling crops, right? So, the thing I want to tell you today, after all of that, is that Mansfield's story can be every community's story. I am now working with the principals who I worked with in Mansfield to create a brand new organization called the American Farm Project. We are gathering up what we learned in Mansfield and we're taking it on the road. We are going to teach any and every community that wants to replicate this model how to do it. And if they don't want to hire us, if they're not interested in bringing us in as experts, we're still going to insist on the core principle of the whole movement if we're going to be successful. You have to begin with successful farmers. You have to begin with successful farmers. You neglect that, you lose all of the strengths itself. But if you begin with successful farmers, you get everything else. You live in a community where your food is being produced in your neighborhood. You have farmers market. Your kids participate in farm to school. Food is a part of community life and economic life. And you get healthy choices that you can afford right there in your neighborhood. So if we get this right, if we actually pull this off, maybe, just maybe, I might make my parents and their generation proud, and we can all finally fix the food system. Thank you.